Hello, I'm Michael Saunders, and I have created this video to share my findings through primary and secondary research in order to answer the question, is flavor only derived by the individual's perception, or does the individual have an affinity towards being conditioned? My article was reviewed and supervised by chefs Bennett and Luciana, Godoy. As a culinary leader, we need to explore a deeper meaning to the perception of flavor, excite all our senses, and experience food differently. Elevating the consumer's palate by focusing on our five senses would change the industry's direction and bring more science into restaurants, as if we were tailoring food to one's own DNA. The mode of these senses is taste. Taste fundamentally uses our senses to communicate the flavor elements to the brain, known as the sensation of flavor, which is perceived through the mouth and throat on contact with a substance. Flavor is a result of product characteristics and can be considered an objective technical concept categorically organized by sweet, sour, spicy, bitter, and umami. This video is designed to introduce the multi-cross-model sensories that enable an individual to experience flavor and develop their perception through the five senses. I argue that by removing the simulated conditions and moving away from the theory of behaviorism and progress to the theory of cognitivism, as it allows for a more profound, meaningful method of learning and perceiving the perception of flavor. To begin to understand the perception of flavor of an individual, a clear understanding of the term and how we perceive flavor needs to be defined to unravel the significance of whether or not an individual can define the perception of flavor. The perception of flavor is based around the human sciences known as gastronomy, which can be defined as the science of flavor and tasting, as it infers a combination of natural sciences of flavor and the human-related sciences. The last definition to cover is flavor, and it is defined as the combination of taste and odor influenced by the sensations of pain, heat, and by cold and tactile sensations. The definition provided indicates that our senses are all involved in the registrant of flavor. Gustatory is our taste, olfactory is our smell, and tactile is our touch. Flavor is the discriminating factor that creates the basis of food choice, preference, and consumption. The discussion of how our body experiences flavor is necessary in order to connect physiology to our five senses. It's important to know this context in order to make inferences without generalization. This section covers terms with a definition of its significance in the perception of flavor while taking into account that an individual has three neural systems that all make up the individual's experience through smell, taste, and touch. Now that there is an understanding of gastronomy and flavor, and the role each has, a definition of our physiology is vital to bring the perception of flavor together. Gustation and smell are known as the chemical senses and are the gustatory system's essential functions, where it registers chemical properties. These components are sweet, salty, acidic, bitter, and umami. Registration is done through taste receptor cells, which lie in the taste buds. Olfactory receptors are found in the nose bridge and at the top of the nose in a substance called the mucosa. The mucosa is designed to filter out any flavored molecules and any foreign bodies to the individual. Outside these gustatory and olfactory systems, the components of flavor are registered by the trigeminal nervous system. The trigeminal system is all over the body and refers to the sense of touch. In the perception of flavor, it plays the role of mouthfeel and invokes a response from one of our five senses. Here, I will explain how our perception involves the five senses, starting with sweet. The perception of sweetness starts with a chemical interaction on the tongue between the tongue receptor protein A and the tasted molecule otherwise known as glucose. We see this known as H binding. The sense of salty is the perception of salt level, and it is referred to as flavor enhancer, but may cause problems if the wrong quantity is used. Salt also depends on the cation and the anion in the salt crystal structure, as some highly molecular salts can be bitter and some salts are even tasting sweet. The sense of sour is also known as acidic, or so some think. However, the relationship between sour and acidic is much more complicated. Sour usually causes a somatosensory reaction from pain, burning, and fizzy responses. The sense of bitter is known to be associated with amino acids, peptides, and alkaloids. Most citrus fruits contain a bitter taste, which is due to the flavonoid compound known as nardarine, which is made up of two sugars, both glucose, that make up the structure of its parts. And finally, umami is considered the fifth taste sense more recently, where it was determined that tasting umami was tasting glutamate with a very coating mouthfeel. Cheese is an excellent example for the umami flavor profile. Now that each of our senses has been described and how they contribute to the way we perceive flavor through our neural systems, it's time to review consumer methods and how they relate to the following sample that's being argued against. The methods that I brief on are two basic consumer research methods that are used in order to understand the similarities and differences between the stimulus and the response. Those methods to understand the consumer at a perceptual level are projective mapping and preference mapping. Both methods are used for chocolate, cheese, wine, citrus, juice, and fruits. The combination of this process makes consumers perceive sensory evaluation's relevance, which is to estimate the similarities and the differences. These presets illustrate the difference among the individuals assessing the samples for evaluation. However, holistically, consumers will generate sensory spaces that will reflect how certain items are perceived based on cognitive capacity. Moreover, some of these configured samples and their lower dimensionalities are not true reflections of all consumers' cognitive representations. To guide this definition, there will be an introduction to behaviorism with an example to an attempt to place a counter-argument against my argument in this video. After I discuss the sample and its relevancy to my argument, I will break down a survey conducted to support my argument that we should be using cognitivism to study the perception of flavor rather than using behavior methods that generalize more than they interpret the individual. To work off the last slide, a study that should be considered is the study done on rats with Pavlovian learning. This study, and the one that this video is primarily arguing against, is how humans learn and develop the perception of flavor. One method of learning is through conditioned responses to flavors that were previously paired with other tastes to provoke the unconditioned reactions. This type of learning is Pavlovian learning and is done by creating a reaction from a conditioned stimulus and creating the same reaction from the unconditioned stimulus, resulting in a behavioral response that is appropriate to the stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus in the study. However, it is hard to distinguish flavor preferences based on Pavlovian learning, as conditioning is complicated when establishing a conditioned response for novel flavors. The results from this study suggest that rats can learn conditional flavor learning regardless of whether preference was reinforced or through its palatability and nutrient density. This infers that Pavlovian conditioning is prevalent, significantly when the unconditioned stimulus affects flavor preference learning. Additionally, taste-odor pairs could be learned from minimal co-exposure to the stimuli. If we require to learn to form a taste-odor pair, it is possible to unlearn the combination. In the theory of behaviorism, by naively subjecting individuals to a general sample, the parameters take away from the freedom of choice. Simulation is the only way that this method collects data, and overgeneralizes the results and takes the perception of flavor and the individual's essence away from how that individual feels. Further, we cannot subject this type of influence in order to understand the nature and meaning of flavor perception. Most people missed what Pavlov was trying to prove, and that was he already understood that motivation and biological needs are necessary byproducts. He wanted us to see that cognition was relevant, which then later became referred to as classical conditioning. I argue that by removing the simulated conditions and moving away from the theory of behaviorism and progress to cognitivism, it allows for a more profound, meaningful method of learning and perceiving the perception of flavor. In past studies, we have seen the generalization of how people perceptually mistake the idea of choice in a controlled environment, as opposed to choices they would make of said free choice. For example, insofar as how it was understood, the Pavlov experiment misrepresents the individual and makes claims that are conditioned based on the experimenter's parameters. So I argue that cognitivism allows the participant to reorganize their experiences in order to make sense of the stimuli presented in the environment. This sense occurs through flashes of insight while processing the stimuli. Unlike the behaviorist who considers learning the involvement of a response to a stimulus from an environment, cognitivism contends that learning is deeper than a generalization. In cognitivism, the assumption that pre-existing knowledge must be present in order to compare and process new information for learning. This existing knowledge bank is known as a schema. A schema is used for the benefit of learning when the individual is actually aware of their background knowledge and exposure to the skills required to understand the learning objective. That is why we provided the background behind registering flavors to remind everyone that not one person can experience exactly what another person can. Additionally, to understand that my argument embraces a natural response. Two different research strategies that we included were primary research with online surveys and secondary research through scholarly and peer-reviewed articles. Content analysis is used to interpret the meaning of open-ended questions and quantifying those interpretations to draw a tentative conclusion of the sample. 2 different surveys were designed. One was for the general public, and the other was tailored to the industry leaders. Of the 5,460 emails sent, 2,701 went to the George Brown Chef School, and the other 2,759 emails went to the School for Hospitality and Tourism Management. A response rate returned at a 2% participation rate. In this survey, 107 responses were collected, and after filtering the data, 36.45% were removed because they were drinkers or smokers. The second method used is a secondary research in order to grasp an understanding of how the perception of flavor works through a system of multisensory modalities that all factor into how we register flavor and its properties. This survey to reflect on what they learned through flavor terms, physiology, neural systems, and pavilion learning. From here, I will interject another method of collecting data and create a deeper understanding of the human perception of flavor through cognitivism. Throughout the survey response, while using content analysis, I respond using cognitivism to interpret the answers. Cognitivism understands that previous data is only there for comparison, and not to be based or generalized, rather inclusive, a little subjective, but more accurate to someone else's desires, wants, and needs. The research was designed for the diversity of international and domestic participants that gave insight into how flavor is perceived without any bias of culture, conditioning, judges, or any other extrinsic factors that could compromise the survey. Most of the participants' background were 18 to 25 years of age, which made up 51.47% of our sample. Over 73% of our participants have a college diploma to a master's degree, and most of the participants have only been in the industry for the past 3 to 5 years, yielding 26% of the total sample. After the participants answered the background questions, the participants were asked a pool of open-ended questions to express how they connect with food, with no conditions on how they answer. These questions were a way to get inside a person's mind and explore and respect the individual as an individual, and to prevent any bias or judgment. The participants all answered anonymously through Microsoft Forms. Here, I will provide a couple of questions and what the results suggest. In question 17 on the survey, when you affiliate your 5 senses with food, what emotional affiliations do you make and what does it mean to you? Now, some of the general public is aware of their 5 senses. However, the results indicate that there is a lot of similarities in responses to the chefs. However, the general public does not think about the experience they have while consuming food. Knowledge is power, and if our culinary leaders are not sharing their ideas and concepts through their menus, the general public will never be anything but an experiment based on theories of behaviorism right down to the restaurant level. Question 19. When you think of a menu, how do you make the connection between the theme of the menu and the style of cuisine? As there was no real connection and commonality, the general public finds the menu language and how relevant the menu language is connected with the ingredients to the dish, suggested that the menu's location on the menu was relevant to understand the theme. However, some chefs put the guests first and said they need to research their target markets and the dish before creating a menu or theme, indicating that the chefs that are educated in culinary arts have some background in product development or marketing research. A larger sample is required to understand how deep the knowledge of our senses play in the industry and whether or not chefs today consider the way we experience flavor through our own perception. While the findings have been categorized, there were a couple of limitations to the study. As most respondents were through George Brown College due to the global pandemic, it limited us from diversifying responses outside the college community. The second limit to know is more from a social and cultural aspect by defining questions that could help us understand more about people's purchasing choices. The third limitation was the sample size. In future studies of this discussion, we should increase the sample to understand better the perception of flavor in a more general scenario for the public to access. The fourth limitation to mention was some participants did not understand some of the open-ended questions. This limited how many responses we had, so future studies should simplify the questions for the general public to participate in the entire survey. Through this presentation, we have discovered that the perception of flavor is coursed through a system of multisensory cross models whereby the factors of our five senses contribute to making how we experience tasting flavor and inferring our preferences. This sensory information is transmitted through our neural system, made up of the olfactory, gustatory, and the trigeminal nervous system, giving us our smell, taste, and tactile perceptions that transmit through our axons and fire into different parts of the brain to relay the signals we experience through tasting. We also discussed the perception of flavor survey to understand how personal flavor is valued and allow the individual to freely express how they feel about sensory-specific taste and what influences their purchases. This includes sound, color, packaging, and language, or rather how the package text or menu text is expressed, as it seems to influence the majority of those surveyed. When conducting sample studies and placing these works through content analysis, understanding people pulls away from classical conditioning and allows them to share their perceptions and insights through cognitivism. Additionally, cognitive-focused direction creates the potential for more depth and meaningful learning to the individual with a lasting impact. In future studies of food preference and the perception of flavor, this theory should be incorporated for an understanding of color, sound, and texture in order to begin to understand how an individual perceives flavor at a cognizant level. As culinary leaders, we need to be cognizant of consumer perception and should take the initiative to further explore the world of flavor. Thank you for your time, and thank you for listening to my presentation.